So we're carrying on with the series on biblical poetry and how to read biblical poetry, its beauty, its depth. And we looked in the previous video at poetry in general and specifically biblical poetry and the characteristics that characterize this poetry. And now the question arises, so how should I read biblical poetry? In order to let the text actually express itself in its own way and lead us to its message, it's really important to understand and take note of the characteristics that were mentioned in the last video. And to that end, we should look at three things: at individual words, at the way in which these words are put together, and at the overall picture that the poem presents. So in this video, we'll start with looking at the individual words, the building blocks. A poem, of course, is made up of words. At times, the meaning of a word is made clear only by the framework in which it's found. And sometimes one word can have the power of a key to open a door or open even a house. The reader must read words with an awareness of the meaning and the contribution of each word. So this is important to also understand the way that words are used, firstly individually in any kind of literature, but especially in poetry and the characteristics that we mentioned. So, the word's meaning. A word has a literal meaning, of course we know that, that appears in a dictionary. You can look up the dictionary and see the meaning of the word. But in many cases, there are nuances to the meaning of a word that are especially culturally framed. And in this case, you might say a word that in your culture will have a whole series of associations to it that are beyond the actual just meaning of the word. And it's critical to understand the poem, as a foundation to understand the poem, to check the different meanings of the poem, both on the level of the meaning of the word, the dictionary meaning, but also, as far as we can, looking at its meaning in the context and how it's working in the poem. So this means that there are two factors that are really important in this regard. One is the biblical language, to remember the biblical language, and the second is the poetic style. Biblical language in general, well, as English speakers, of course, you will be reading translations. It can be invaluable to learn some biblical Hebrew, even if it's just the alphabet, so you can use certain tools. But even if you don't learn Hebrew, and you don't, there are other tools available. There's translation and different translations, especially if you're English speakers. There's many translations that you can compare. And one sort of translation that actually can help you is a literal translation. Because that kind of translation can help you get behind the other translations that maybe have smoothed the text out. A literal translation might be less smooth, but it might help you understand that there are different things going on behind the text here in the Hebrew. So I would actually recommend looking for literal translations and having one just available as you're studying biblical poetry. If you have a computer or mobile phone available, then there are several good online tools you can use for free. For starters, on our website, we have the Read the Bible. If you look at the top of the page in our website, the Bible study mode provided by the Bible Society in Israel that has its tools. But there are many tools that you can use online in English. But apart from those tools, the important thing is having a basic understanding of how this poetry works, and that kind of understanding can set you a long way in knowing how to look for and be sensitive to the way that the different poetic devices can lead you to a deeper meaning and understanding of the text. That's as far as language is concerned. About the poetic style, in poetry, the poet can use words in special ways, in ways sometimes that are just ordinary, sometimes they are out of the ordinary, or even novel and innovative. And as readers, we should be ready for surprises when we're reading any kind of poetry, but also in biblical poetry. So I'd encourage you to develop the habit of both looking at the meaning of each word and using the tools that I mentioned, maybe a literary translation, look at the meaning of each word, but then also examine that word in its context to grasp its function in the text. And as a simple example, let me take a word that is translated in different ways in Hebrew, but is also used in Hebrew in different ways, the word lalechet, whose dictionary meaning means to move forward by foot, or to walk, or to go. In different contexts, this word can, however, have associated meanings and can function in different ways, and I want to give a few examples. Very simple example that might just help you just become sensitive to this kind of thing. The first example from Psalm 122, verse 1 and 2. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. So Psalm 122 speaks of Jerusalem and her importance in the house of the Lord, and it's actually a psalm of ascent, which is talking about the people of Israel who 3 times a year went up to Jerusalem, to the temple, physically went up. So the words here, let us go, which translate the word that I mentioned in Hebrew, lalechet, that's a good translation actually here, and literal, of the people actually walking up to Jerusalem. Let us go, let us walk. So in this particular case, the actual meaning of the word is what we also find in the context. If we take another example, Psalm 23, verse 4, a psalm that we know well, verse 4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So here, David is talking about walking through the valley of the shadow. Of course, this is within the metaphor of the psalm of his relationship with the Lord as a relationship of a sheep and the shepherd, and going through this valley. So on the one sense, it's talking about a sheep walking, but in the context of the psalm and the whole metaphor, we understand that David is talking about a situation that he's going through, some really hard situation in his life that this picture of walking through is describing very well. But here again, we understand in the context that the word lalechet, to walk, actually here has a figurative meaning, a metaphorical meaning, talking about this difficult time in David's life that he went through. Another example from Psalm chapter 1, verse 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. And of course here we see this process, walk, stand, sit in the negative. The man is blessed who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. But what does this mean? Of course, when we look at the psalm and we understand that it's actually again figuratively describing different stages of involvement, possible involvement in the ways of the wicked, we understand that actually it's talking about behavior and not physical walking. So in this case, that word it's the same word, but it describes behavior. And the last example I would take is from Psalm 39, verse 13. In Hebrew, that's verse 14, by the way. In the Psalm, sometimes the verses are different because of the title of the Psalm, which in Hebrew is counted as the first verse, and in English sometimes not. So this is verse 13 in English, Psalm 39. Turn your gaze away from me, that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. Well, the word here, depart, is again the word in Hebrew, lelechet. And the poet actually prays that the Lord will remove from him his difficulties, that he feels that God has brought on him. Before he departs, he goes. But what does that mean here? It's obviously talking about his death. And it talks about that in the Hebrew, before I depart. So here, again, this is a symbolic meaning of the word, which is talking about death. So this is just a few examples with one word where we need to be sensitive. Very simple example, that a word can be used differently in different contexts. We need to know its a dictionary meaning, but we also need to look at the context to see what it's saying. So hopefully that will help you with this stage as we're looking at the importance of individual words. And in the next video, we'll go on to start looking at the way that words are joined together in biblical poetry.